And welcome back to the Wellness Paradox podcast. I'm so delightful that you've joined us on this journey towards greater human flourishing. As always, I'm your host, Michael Stack, an exercise physiologist by training and a health entrepreneur and a health educator by trade. And I'm fascinated by a phenomena I call the wellness paradox. This paradox, as I view it, is the trust, interaction, and communication gap that exists between fitness professionals and our medical community. This podcast is all about closing off that gap by disseminating the latest, most evidence-based, and most engaging information in the health sciences. And to do that in episode 104, we're joined by Dr. Alona Pulde and Dr. Matthew Lederman. And we're going to talk about their book, Wellness to Wonderful. And as you could probably imagine, I absolutely love the title of this book because it incorporates the concept of wellness, but also the concept of being joyful and how wonderful leading a healthy, well life can be. And this conversation, although you would think that we were going to really dive into a deep conversation around physical activity, which we do get into, spends a lot of time around the importance of connection and how you can really help people as a fitness or wellness professional connect with what they meaningfully need to make exercise or movement something that is not a chore or a checkbox, but something that is truly enjoyable and meaningful. And by way of that, it will be sustainable. I think this is an absolutely really thought-provoking conversation. And I actually said it in the podcast. It ended up going in a direction that I wasn't really expecting because we spent very little time talking about exercise and a lot of time talking about the importance of, connection, checking in, and just the importance of, good communication with yourself, but also good communication with your clients or your patients. Any information we'd like to share with you from the day's episode, which will be abundant, can be found on the show notes page. That's been going to wellnessparadoxpod.com/episode 104. Please enjoy this conversation with Alona and Matthew. Today, we're delighted to be joined by Dr. Alona Pulde and Dr. Matthew Lederman. Thank you both for joining us so much.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks for having us.
I'm really excited to have this conversation because I'm familiar with some of your previous work, and I'm sure some of our audience will be familiar with your previous work. But you've wrote a book that we're going to dive into in this discussion, and certainly, the title of your book will resonate with our audience, Wellness to Wonderful, because we are a wellness-oriented podcast. But before we get into the discussion around the book and the principles that our audience can take from it, why don't you both give us an idea of your background, just so our audience has some context?
So I am a family physician, also trained in traditional Chinese medicine. And my passion, though, is around nutrition and lifestyle medicine.
Awesome. Matt?
And I'm trained in Western medicine, so internal medicine initially, then nutrition and lifestyle medicine, and then also completed my certification in nonviolent communication as a trainer in that as well.
Awesome. And you forgot to mention the most important part. You're an alum of the University of Michigan.
Yes. Go blue, go blue. And she unfortunately went to UCLA, not Michigan. But we won't hold that.
Yeah, we won't hold that against you. And now we get to play against you on a frequent basis. For those of you that are paying attention to the dynamics of college football. So without going down that rabbit hole, I am curious, how did you guys come together originally as a team? Because you guys kind of, different backgrounds, different colleges. So how did you guys come together to collaborate?
Yeah, so we worked when she was a resident at Kaiser Hospital in Los Angeles. I was attending there, and we crossed paths that way and met and pretty much hit it off right away. I mean, we're both interested in sort of looking outside the box. We both had similar challenges around conventional medicine being really important, but not enough to fix all of the issues and challenges people are faced with. And then we got together and one thing led to another, and here we are.
Yeah, the Kaiser system, for our audience that may not be aware of it, I mean, that is the genesis of the ACSM's Exercises Medicine Initiative. That's Dr. Bob Salas that did a lot of that work there. So that's interesting that you come from that same organization. So, you guys are obviously very well known for, the documentary work that you did, and now you've transitioned over to, writing this book, Wellness to Wonderful. So what inspired you to take this, next step beyond the documentary that you did into this book?
Yeah, I think Matt and I, thinking always outside of the box, are always trying to see how do we optimize our well-being, our life experience. And that's what led us into nutrition and lifestyle medicine. And even in that space of kind of honing our diet and honing our physical activity and getting our sleep regulated and optimized, there were still opportunities in our life for optimization. And it really boiled down to, in a world of infinite possibilities, why can't our life be wonderful? It can. And then what does that look like? And that led us to the 9 pillars that we identified in Wellness to Wonderful. In each of those, when we tend to them, when we have awareness around them, can really elevate that life experience so that we have the health, longevity, and joy that we want out of our lives.
That's great. The concept of joy, I think, is so important. I think, for years, the medical model is all about just been, don't be sick and, treat disease or manage disease, however you want to frame it. But, ultimately, at the end of the day, if you're leading a healthy, well lifestyle, you would hope the output of that would be joyous and wonderful. So that's why I love the title of the book so much. Now, you mentioned the 9 pillars that you talked about in the book, and unfortunately we don't have enough time to talk about all of them, but just really quickly, either one of you, can you just briefly lay out the 9 pillars and maybe a short little definition of how you view it, and then we'll dive more into the physical activity component that you talked about in chapter 9.
Yes. So it's we start with self. So connection to yourself, knowing what's going on inside of you, what you're feeling, what you're needing, becoming intrinsically motivated versus external factors sort of telling you what to do. So getting that internal guidance. And then from there, there's your resourcing your internal world with 4 pillars around. One is sleep, nutrition, activity, and play. And play is recreation, sort of content-free time. Mm-hmm. When you resource yourself with those pillars and you're aware of sort of that connection to the self and what you want, and you've regulated your nervous system so that you can now go and connect to the external world, which is the other pillars. Mm-hmm. And that's family, friends, work, meaning and purpose at your work, spirituality, something bigger than yourself, connection, interdependence to the world around you, and then natural world, which is all of the life on this planet. So it's self, sleep, nutrition, activity, play, family, friends, work, spirituality, and the natural world.
Yeah, and the book does a great job, and I really appreciate having the ability to read through it ahead of time. The book does an amazing job of breaking down all these things. So I definitely encourage our audience. It's going to be linked up on the show notes page. Definitely something great to pick up, because we're not going to be able to get in the nuance of even everything in chapter 9 in this conversation, let alone all of the pillars that are in there. I am curious, before we dive into that, coming out of the pandemic, I feel like there's this kind of shift that's taken place in our culture of, we're kind of ascending beyond just this concept of fitness, and wellness is taking on a more prominent role. From your perspectives, as you write this book and as you talk to a lot of people about this, do you think that the country as a whole, or maybe the world as a whole, is more receptive now than ever to this more holistic view of what it means to truly be healthy and well?
I would say on one hand, people are, right? I think people value connection. Our whole book is really founded on connection, right? That's a foundational piece. And we link in Wellness to Wonderful, we link how when you're disconnected, that's actually a pro-inflammatory state. Mm-hmm. We talk about that. We talk about how connection is anti-inflammatory, and we show all that, right? And so I think people are starting to see that. They're valuing it. There's science supporting it. But then on the other hand, it's not a quick fix, right? When people ask us, hey, what's the magic bullet? What's the 3 things I need to do to have a wonderful life? Like, that thinking is still externally driven versus what we do is we have to teach you how to cultivate the skills of looking inside what your values are and aligning your behaviors and actions with your values. And then it's not this destination. Think of the 9 pillars as 9 children that you have to care for the rest of your life. It's not that you're going to just, oh, I get to a certain point, my kids are fine, right? You worry about your children for the rest of your life. You tend to them for the rest of your life. And some days one child needs more attention, other days the other child needs more attention. But overall, you're aware of them and you're caring for them all. That's the way we look at the pillars, but it's within that work and that effort of caring for your children that the joy lives. So if you're trying to bypass the effort and have it be easy, it's similar to, adopting a 17-year-old and then sending them off to college because you want to bypass the work of raising a child. Right? You would never do that because you're missing out on all the joy. That shift is hard for some people right now, but when they get it, boy, does life really change for the better.
And I think there's also an environmental, like societal opportunity too, where individually we might crave it. But then, we are in a society that really supports productivity and efficiency and burning the candle at both ends. And what that creates is us living in a survival state that then leads to a scarcity mentality. And that scarcity mentality really constricts the way we look at life and creates a me and more kind of a outlook on life. And so there's a both and.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. The connection point, Matthew, that you bring up is so important. I mean, it was just a week or 2 weeks ago, Surgeon General, released a report on the epidemic of loneliness. And, I'm constantly reading, we are more connected through the internet than we ever have been, but we are never been seemingly more, disconnected from so many people around us. So I think that's, although that's not the primary emphasis of this conversation, a lot of what the fitness industry does provide is an opportunity for community. And I think that, that shouldn't be lost on any of us as we have the discussion.
Yeah. And that's where I think also it's helpful to know that connection, and when you're feeling more connected, and I'll tell you how we talk about connection, right? It's not just being near somebody or being nice to somebody, but when you are connected, you're more likely to be able to take care of yourself and do things like exercise. You have more hope, you have more inspiration, you have more just energy in general to care for yourself. So they're bi-directional. In other words, one pillar affects the other. When you sleep better, you're going to be able to make better food choices. When you're connected, you're going to have more of a desire to be active, and you're going to have people that you want to play with and you can mix activity in with. And to me, it's about these 9 pillars support each other. And if you really embrace it, it gets easier over time instead of harder over time, because you're not using willpower, they're fueling each other. And I think with connection, what we mean is, and what we talk about at foundation is nonviolent communication and the consciousness behind that, which I think is really powerful. And we talk about that in Wellness to Wonderful. And we teach people those skills. And it's about transforming how you talk, how you think, and the actions that you take so that you can create a quality of connection with another person where compassionate giving and receiving flows naturally, where you can show up as your true full self and you trust or have skill to navigate it so that the other person comes closer as a result versus pulls away or judges or there's conflict. When you have that type of foundation with somebody and with people and the skills to maintain that, that's what we mean by connection. It's a deeper thing than just giving someone a thumbs, what is a like, on Instagram or something, right?
Yeah, such a great point. Connection has become so transactional in our world because of that exact thing. Like, it's not clicking heart on someone's post does not equal connection. I'm going to come back to that connection and nonviolent communication element that you just mentioned in a moment. I do want to dive into the chapter 9 where you talk about the importance of activity. And I'd like you to maybe abstract some of the lessons that you learned in writing this book, and also your perspective as physicians, because that's incredibly valuable to our audience. And what would you like fitness professionals to know about the concept of activity as you presented in the book?
Well, it's interesting because I think connection actually flows really nicely into this chapter, right? Because what we want to do is, instead of people thinking about all the external markers of what is the right exercise regimen, the quote unquote right regimen, it's finding what someone else's internal motivation is and where they're moved to do it, right? And that's what's sustainable long term, which is what we really care about for health. So if I tell someone they have to run or they have to lift weights, in fact, I run into this trouble myself. I've talked to Alona about this personally, where I have this idea of what the right amount of exercise is, and I'm so type A and gung-ho that I can do it even if I don't like it. So my challenge is actually to connect into myself, because I can do it all. But what do I really enjoy? So, like, for example, I'm really enjoying doing yoga and doing this bike. And I was like, you know what? I'm not lifting weights and running like I used to, because I was running I have to get the mileage in. I got to lift a certain amount of weights. And I'm like, you think this is enough exercise? And to me, again, I was looking outside, like, what's the right amount? I think there are some guidelines that you can sort of use as a framework, but then how do we check in and say, hey, how am I feeling when I do this? I started stretching in the evening before I go to bed. Right? And I do some of the foam rollers and the ball and things like that. And I was like, wow, like I started waking up and not feeling as tight. Like, it was almost, I would wake up where I felt like fatigued. Like I just did exercise. I'm like, I just woke up. What's going on? But my body was tight. Or I get out of the car and I'm like, oh, I'm feeling looser.
Yeah.
For me to check in with that, all of a sudden that's fueling my desire to do my stretching at night, versus checking a box got harder and harder. But now when I connect to, oh boy, do I like how I feel when I get out of that car. And boy, do I like how I feel when I wake up in the morning. And do I like how nice I fall asleep so easily now, because I do this stretching and it's a little bit of time to myself. So do you see how we're still bringing in movement and activity, but it's coming from that internal drive instead of external? How is that to hear that? Like, what comes up when you hear that?
Yeah, I appreciate the question. It's rare that the question gets turned around to me. It's refreshing, and I think it's necessary to hear, because I can tell you, as an exercise physiologist by trade and training, you mentioned guidelines, and we're very good in our field of there's the Surgeon General's guidelines: 150 minutes per week of moderate to vigorous intensity physical activity, 2 days per week of muscle strengthening, or then you can even get more granular with like the American College of Sport Medicine's FIT principle guidelines. But I've been in this industry, working with people for 25 years, and I can tell you that those broad guidelines don't really resonate with any one person until you figure out a way to filter it through the lens of what they enjoy. So I think all of that to say, it's refreshing to hear, particularly from medical professionals that are, what is the best practice clinical guidelines for something, that it's important to also filter this through the lens of the individual.
I love that you embrace that as well, because the most important thing I believe for healing and well-being is to connect with people and for them to feel cared for and heard. So when you, as a health professional or a wellness professional, the first thing you can do to improve someone's life is to connect them with what's alive inside themselves and support that. So to me, that's what this is, to each person. Hey, there's these guidelines we want to sort of shoot for. And if you check in with yourself, my guess is sitting on the couch watching Netflix, eating potato chips doesn't really feel wonderful for your body, but maybe there's some other stuff that you're distracting from, some other pain in your life. We can deal with that too. But when you check in with your body, you do want to move. And these guidelines are a framework similar to nutrition, right? When they have the RDA, that's for populations. That doesn't mean if you don't get this amount of isoleucine, in your diet every day, you're in trouble, right? It's like, hey, here's some guidelines. There's buffers on there, right? So do what works for you, but find the food that really resonates.
Right. I think ultimately that's what it's about, right? We can tell people what to do, but it really comes down to what they're willing to do and what they'll do sustainable, what they can sustain doing. And when you can incorporate the joy, when you can bring in joy into your nutrition choices, into your movement choices, when you can bring play into that too, then that's the internal motivation that, oh, I like this. I want to keep doing this. And when we get there, we can also start getting expansive around trying other things.
Right. And I like the more pillars you bring in, the better, right? The more sustainable it's going to be. So when I would do exercise and I run on the treadmill at the gym, or when I go to my daughter's school, pick her up, and all of her kids want to play freeze tag, and I'm it, and I'm the one that has to chase everybody. And now we're playing and we're connecting and we're moving. Now I just hit 3 pillars, and I'm like, oh, wait a second, I just did 45 minutes of exercise. I didn't even realize it. It wasn't part of my routine. What box do I check? I didn't have a freeze tag box to check on my wellness sheet. But and then I'm like, hey, if I just did freeze tag, is that enough exercise? So I start like having to check inside versus look at these markers outside and saying, oh, I got to do freeze tag, but I better do that hour run on the treadmill because that's what's okay. You see what I'm saying? Like, we're trying to teach people this internal ability to discern.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I mean, ultimately, you are your own best coach if you can learn how to listen to yourself appropriately.
Yes, I love that.
So let's go back to this communication and this connection concept, because everything that you just said around physical activity and exercise and all of these pillars, which very clearly the virtuous cycle exists when you start to implement them into your life. Your healthcare providers, your allied health professionals, that you work with people just like a lot of our audience does. How do you recommend, or what would be some best practices around these principles of nonviolent communication and connection that you would recommend to the professionals that listen to this podcast to do exactly what you're talking about, which is really help someone learn about themselves to be able to figure out what is meaningful for them to implement?
Yes. So the first step for me, and I think this is to just step back and say, wow, does this make life more wonderful? Like, when I connect with other people and I take the time, because we're not taught this, right? This is new for a lot of people. It not only serves the client, it serves me too. We found that job satisfaction went up tremendously, because what do we naturally want to do as human? One of our greatest needs is to contribute to other people. We love contributing. That's just a drive, right? So when you focus on connecting and you're able to care for compassionately with someone else, and then you're able to help them make their lives better, there's like nothing better in the world. Like, that is so rewarding. So then the question is, what's going to facilitate that process? And to me, there's the part that we talked about, right? Connecting inside. But then there's also, like we talk about in Wellness to Wonderful in the book, there's some steps that can help you, almost like a framework. And a lot of people think when they hear nonviolent communication, they hear these steps or framework, like that is nonviolent communication. That's what you have to do. Again, it's that desire to put it in this right, wrong, like, here's what you got to do. This is the right way to communicate. And that's not what we're saying. We're saying that if you just learn to check in with you, check in with what works for the other person, that's the first step. Now, we give some steps around making observations versus evaluations, sharing feelings instead of thoughts, sharing your needs instead of strategies, making requests instead of demands. And this is really helpful not only in the work atmosphere, in the work environment, but also for our marriage, or my partnership with Alona. It also is important as parents. It's made all of that so much better. So we have classes that we teach people how to do this. It's in the book, but now it's just a matter of taking time to learn how to do that, because we're naturally taught, not everybody, I'm generalizing, that when something doesn't feel good to me, I try to think about who outside me is to blame. And when something doesn't feel good to me, I work really hard to make that feeling go away, right? I want to try. So I'm there's this idea of like, who's to blame and how do I resist or make that go away? Versus like, when something doesn't feel good to me, an unpleasant feeling is a sign that I have a need that's not being met, right? So if I have an unpleasant feeling of hunger, I have a need for food. So I don't try and shoot the messenger, which is the feeling, and try and make the feeling go away. I try to meet the need, which means I go find food. So to me, those steps is all part of the nonviolent communication process. It just takes a little time to learn them, and it's a lifelong journey. But even just showing up differently and saying, hey, I want to come from this nonviolent communication consciousness instead of a right, wrong, good, bad consciousness, life shifts immediately. Does that make sense, or do you want me to clarify anything there?
Yeah, no, I was just going to say it's a very kind of an Eastern, meditative, non-judgmental kind of, like lens to it. I mean, I practice meditation, and I think that, just that awareness element that, that practice brings. First, you got to be just aware of what's going on inside for yourself before you ever can start to do that for other people. But I think what I was going to, bring up is it seems like this is probably more of a challenge nowadays than what it's ever been, because we are so distracted and inundated with all this stuff out there that it's hard to get in here. Do you have any advice for professionals as to how to, and I don't know, maybe this is the $1 million question, but how, during your busy day, like, how do you think about how to check in with yourself and make sure that you're doing these things that allow you to show up as this person for somebody else?
Yeah, I think there are a number of tools, and some of them, we talk about in Wellness to Wonderful. I was just talking to my 9-year-old daughter who's doing a presentation at school, and she's presenting one of those ways. We call it a check-in meter. And it's kind of like that internal barometer where, she has a little paper with all kinds of, everything from a frowny face to a smiley face, but it's, 10 is I'm really wound up and I'm so upset. And, 1 is like, oh, I'm serene. The world is wonderful. And where do I fall in there? And I think that's the awareness. It's a moment. It's self-care versus self-improvement is a moment-to-moment opportunity to kind of check in with, well, what am I feeling and how am I feeling and what am I needing and where am I on that barometer? And, if I'm starting to see that I'm escalating, what can I do about that?
Yeah, and that's where it's really a needs-based consciousness. And we talk about needs, we're talking about their universal human needs. We all have the same needs. If we talk about safety, food, accountability, predictability, love, right? Autonomy. These are needs that we all have. And in any moment, those needs can be up or they can be completely met and they're done. You're not worried about them right then, right? So one moment I have a need for food and then I eat something, I don't have a need anymore for food. That's satisfied. But 4 hours from now, the need might come back up again, right? And then the feelings are basically what let us know that we have needs. I'll feel pleasant feelings when my needs are met. And I'll feel unpleasant feelings when my needs are not met. So if I feel anxious or anxiety, I know that I think I have a need for like security or predictability or safety or comfort, something like one of those needs is coming up. Okay, great. And just connecting to that starts to feel more peaceful inside my body. And then I can say, okay, do I want to take action from myself, or do I want to maybe request someone else to do something that'll help contribute to that need?
Yeah. And I think it's important. It's not just a nice to have, this self-connection. It really is a need to have that contributes to our physical well-being. Because the alternative is kind of living in this artificial harmony state, where we slide things under the rug or we suppress or repress. But the ramifications of that on our physical, emotional, and mental health is huge.
Right. And we talk about this in Wellness to Wonderful too, where connection is not a nice to have. It's like, why are these doctors talking about connection? We have shown, and there's data, and they're getting more and more data on this, that when you are disconnected, and isolated, your body goes from a physiological state of safety to a physiological state of threat. And in that physiological state of threat, you have increased pro-inflammatory cytokines, you have increased hormones, adrenaline and cortisol, and you have shifts in blood flow that go away from the viscera and they go out to the extremities, and shifts in your brain blood flow that make you more reactive, right? All to prepare for threat and to fix the cellular damage that's going to happen as a result of the threat. That's great for a couple of minutes if there's a real threat, but living in that state is disease promoting. And we know that when you have more pro-inflammatory cytokines, you're going to have more insulin resistance.
Yep.
We know that when people are disconnected just from their doctors, right? They have less connection with their doctors. They have increased markers like LDL, bad cholesterol, hemoglobin A1Cs are more out of whack. Perceptions of pain are worse from the same stimuli. Microbiome starts to shift in a negative way. So what my point is, it's really interesting to say connection is not a nice to have.
Mm-hmm.
It has to be part of our health and healing paradigm.
Yeah, that's great. And at an evolutionary level, it just makes so much sense, right? I mean, back in the caveman times, if you were alone, you were probably dead, so
Yes.
the evolutionary biology of that comports with everything you're saying. It's so fascinating. One of the things I love about these kind of conversations that are kind of broadly wellness in nature is you come into a conversation to think you're talking about physical activity and exercise, and then you realize that the conduit to that, as you guys are talking about, is this connection component, and it's fascinating and very, very much needed in our field, as our field kind of reemerges in a lot of sense from COVID and competing with all the virtual technologies that are out there now, the Pelotons and the mirrors and the AI. One thing that none of those devices can give you is human connection. And, that's probably one of the most important commodities, to your point, that exists.
Yeah. And people don't realize the impact of not having that, right? Until you get it and you're like, wow, that felt great.
Yeah.
It's similar like eating an unhealthy diet. You don't realize how bad you feel until you eat a healthy diet.
Yeah.
And to me, that in-person connection is so important. There's something that we cannot replace virtually or with AI. And that if we can find a way to give people more of that, and not just seeing people, that's one thing, but also that space to really share authentically and to be held, spiritually and emotionally, all while you're still doing the other stuff. Because to me, movement is natural. Mm-hmm. If we step back and focus on making life wonderful, movement is part of that. Now, do we need to run on a treadmill? No, but we need to move in ways that include resistance and strength, and flexibility and aerobic, right? Like that's all part of it, because that's how we, like you said, we were designed, how we evolved, right? And similarly, we evolved we're a social species. Mm-hmm. Anything that takes us away, and unfortunately, the Western sort of diet and lifestyle takes us away from not only being social, but from moving in those ways that from the science supports health. Yeah. But it's really just the natural way we're supposed to be. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's such a good point. I feel like I could go in 1,000 different directions, but I want to be respectful of your time and our audience's time. So before we get on to the final couple of questions, while we have a moment, is there anything else from the book beyond the connection and the activity component that you might really want to highlight for the fitness and wellness professionals that are listening? Again, you need to go read the book, but on the odd chance everyone's not going to go out and pick it up right away. Is there anything else you want to point out in the book that you think is particularly salient for fitness and wellness professionals that are listening to this?
It would be salient for
specifically for fitness and wellness.
For fitness and
What would you say there's a common challenge for fitness and wellness, and then maybe we can go from there?
I would say the most common challenge, and maybe I'm going to say this challenge, and maybe it's just going to relate back and you go see the first part of the conversation we just had, but it's getting people to make this a priority, right? Yes. It's that everything in their life is, becomes a greater priority than taking care of their health, their exercise, their nutrition, their sleep. So it's that prioritization issue, and it's hard to coach that effectively. It's just a challenge. So what would you say is maybe the way to combat that?
Yeah, I really think it comes back to self-connection. It comes back to internal motivation. We have to internally want to do this. And what are our reasons? What's our why? Mm-hmm. Why do we want to do this? And then how do we make it fun? How do we, and there are so many creative ways. Like, I know formal exercise for me is not something that I particularly enjoy putting into but I love to read. And I have found that I can read on an elliptical. So I'm really excited to take that time and read while I'm exercising. So how do we get creative around bridging things or bringing things together that really excite people?
Right. And I like the quote that you always talk about. The people who don't make time for wellness are eventually going to have to make time for illness. Right. And to me, it's about, and if you focus on connection, then it's not about an agenda. If I come in saying, how am I going to get you to exercise? We're already disconnected. If instead I come in and I say, what's preventing you from exercising right now? So what's the need that you're meeting by not exercising? Because there's always needs that everything we do is to meet needs. And then if we start connecting to what's going on there and we're curious, we get to a place where they're naturally going to be able to determine what does work for them, because we have to trust they all have a need for movement.
I think that's a key too, is, we get caught up on regimented, structured exercise, and we forget that really the need is movement. How do we move more during the day? And, that can be going out and picking up a basketball game or a soccer game at the park. It could be playing freeze tag with your kids. It could be going for a run or a walk or a hike or dancing or, so there's so many different things that fall into movement.
And sometimes we don't start with the pillar of movement. If they say what's preventing me from moving is I feel nauseous all the time. Or I'm tired all the time. Okay, so then maybe we have to look at some other areas. Well, why are you feeling tired? Well, I'm in this state of fight or flight all the time because I'm really anxious about that. Okay, so now we have a need for regulation of the nervous system. Oh, I'm feeling really tired because I can't sleep well. Oh, well, is that mobilized nervous system? Because you're not going to be able to sleep if you're in fight or flight. Or is that sleep hygiene? Okay, well, you're able to sleep, but you're nauseous all the time. Well, Howard, what's your diet? Let's look at your diet. Oh, I'm nauseous all the time because I'm in this fight with my kids and I haven't seen them in the last year, and I just can't. Oh, so it's connection now with your family or friends that we have to. So we're coming at it curious, even though we know we want to get to a place of movement. Each person has a story inside of them that we're trying to unfold.
I think that's the other thing, is we all have a need for movement. So let's find how to get this. How do we get you to move? Because you have that need.
And what's preventing you from moving if you're not naturally moving? Because we know, and that's the trust that we all have to have. Everybody wants to move if there's nothing preventing them from moving. But a lot of people have barriers to movement right now, which can be a whole range of things that we are going to investigate and be curious around.
I love it. Yeah, the idea of widening the aperture and say, hey, it's not just this one, narrow myopic area of exercise. It's, what's preventing it. And Alona, I love what you said about, thinking of this as movement and not just necessarily exercise, because exercise for a lot of people that don't engage in it is a very off-putting term. They don't want to exercise. But again, everyone does want to move in some way, shape, or form that's fun and meaningful for them. And I think, in the fitness industry in particular, because most people who got in this industry because they like to exercise, we tend to have a very narrow view of what constitutes exercise. And it's normally in the four walls of a gym and involves some piece of equipment. And the reality is if that doesn't connect with someone, to both of your points, they're not going to do it.
Right.
And some people love the gym, right? It's very clear. It's easy. There's a community of people that they see all the time. So we're not against the gym by any stretch. It's about checking in what works for you. And are you going because it's joyful? Are you going because there's I have to and I should? And if there's an I have to or I should, let's shift it. And if we connect, you might still wind up going to the gym, but now you're going to connect to your joy of going to the gym, or you might choose to go somewhere else. But let's get rid of the I have tos and the shoulds.
That's so insightful, and such a broader discussion than just specifically talking about exercise. We're going to link up to the book on the show notes page, but is there anywhere specifically that you'd like to point people to go to find out more about the great work that both of you are doing?
Yeah, we have the website weheal.health. So if you go to weheal.health, you can learn about what we're doing, read more about it, and get support. We have lots of different ways that we support people individually, groups, classes, on all these different pillars. different social media, wellness 2 wonderful with the number 2. So we're really just trying to get the word out, help people raise awareness to this new framework, and really this idea of all the pillars supporting each other, and it's a lifelong sort of tending to, similar to having 9 beautiful children, right? It's a lot of work, but it's really pretty wonderful too at the same time.
I love it. And we're going to link up to all that on the show notes page so everybody has access to it. Before I let you go, we're going to end the podcast with the question that I always end the podcast on. And I love asking this to medical professionals because you are the people that we want to be asking these questions to. My thesis behind this podcast is that the wellness paradox is the gap that exists in communication between fitness and wellness professionals and the medical community. If you could give fitness and wellness professionals one piece of advice as to how to close off that communication gap, what would that be? And I'd love to hear from both of you on this.
Yeah, so for me, the more we can come from a needs-based consciousness, the more likely we are to connect. So if I think of it as us versus them, that mentality is going to maintain the gap. Mm-hmm. But if I can say, wow, there's this gap there, I wonder what's going on for them, and wherever we're not aligned, what's going on for us. Let's check in with the needs. Mm-hmm. So to me, and I'm not sure if there a specific, if you were going to say something that comes up for you in the gap, I'm as a medical doctor, what would you say is one of the gaps or contributors to the gap?
You actually just said it. It's the kind of us versus them siloed mindset. So I really I enjoy that you brought it back to that kind of needs-based perspective.
Right. So that's really important. And I think we have a lot of work to do as doctors to come back to the same level, put ourselves on the same playing field as our patients and all of our other colleagues, right? We're all the same. We all have different skills. We all have different competencies, and we all can contribute and ultimately have the same goals, which is helping people feel better and live better. So the more we can get rid of that, those levels, and I think that's going to take time. So if you're a wellness professional and you're experiencing it, instead of sort of judging it back, so let's say you have an experience where somebody, your judgment is they are talking down to me, mm-hmm. or they're disregarding me. Imagine if I came back with care and sort of empathy and saying, I'm imagining what I'm saying, isn't landing well for you, or is it a little bit unclear as to why I'm valuing doing X, Y, or Z, and you're prioritizing A, B, and C. Would you like to connect around that? Right. So I'm not judging them and saying, oh, see, they're doing that again. I'm sort of trying to bridge and empathize and be with them. So the more I can get a hold of my sort of hate or judgments, which is my work to do, I think the more we're going to come together versus trying to change the other person.
Very well said.
Yeah. And I think you nailed it in that word silo. For me, it's really about the intention of collaboration. Mm-hmm. We have become very siloed. And, it's the medical or the wellness or the nutrition or the trauma informed or, meditation or whatever it is has just become their own silo. And we forget we're a whole person, and there's room for everyone. Mm-hmm. And that collaboration just makes us stronger. And so I think setting that intention and coming from that intention and seeing where do we have the opportunities to collaborate and to elevate mm-hmm. both of our fields.
Well said. Matthew, Alona, thank you so much for joining us on the Wellness Paradox.
No, thank you for having us. I love the work you're doing.
Well, I hope you enjoyed that conversation with Alona and Matthew as much as I did. If you found it insightful and informative, please share with your friends and colleagues. Those shares make a big difference for us. Any information we'd like to share with you from today's episode can be found on the show notes page. That's by going to wellnessparadoxpod.com/episode 104. Please be on the lookout for our next episode when it drops in 2 weeks. And don't forget to subscribe through your favorite podcast platform. Until we chat again next, please be well.